Thank you, Melissa, and good morning, everybody. Yes, as Melissa said, it's midnight New Zealand time, so I very much appreciate the slight change in programming. So I've been working as a health and safety professional in New Zealand for almost 20 years. This year, I've been researching risk velocity as part of a Masters of Health in Workplace Health and Safety at Victoria University of Wellington, Te Herenga. One of my case studies applied risk velocity to bibliotoxicology, and I'm delighted to present the findings of that research to this symposium this morning. And I apologise in advance if I stumble very slightly over my presentation. Besides the fact it's midnight, I'm recovering from concussion from a car accident in July, and verbal presentation is a little bit more challenging than it normally would. So, risk velocity, it's the missing part of risk management. We have many definitions of risk in the literature. Two of the major definitions come from international standards. ISO 31000 defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives, which means that a risk is about identifying what our objectives are and where uncertainties exist that relate to those situations. One of the other major definitions that I work with a lot is ISO 41001, which defines risk as a combination of likelihood and consequence. But what's interesting is neither of those major definitions include consideration of time or speed. So bow tie analysis is a risk technique that visually identifies the relationship between threats, consequences, the top event or the cause, and the controls, which can be either proactive or preventative, and reactive or recovery. It was a process developed in the oil and gas industry in the early 1990s following the Piper Alpha North Sea platform disaster, and I use it extensively both in my research and in my professional practice. So I have defined bow tie analysis as a risk technique that combines a fault tree with an event tree and shows the relationship between threats, consequences, top event, and controls influenced by both risk and control velocity. So the concept of risk velocity was introduced into enterprise risk management in 2009, which introduced time as a missing element in risk. There were three elements of risk velocity in the literature, and I identified, oops, just realized I need to hide that. I identified a fourth one during the application of velocity to bow tie analysis. So those four parts of risk velocity, I identified risk velocity time to cause, or RVTTC, from the literature as the time that passes between the identification of an area of uncertainty or a risk and when that risk is close enough to cause initial threats. It's shown at the left-hand side of a bow tie analysis diagram. Each of the identified threats has an RVTTC that indicates how quickly each individual threat could eventuate. I identified risk velocity time to impact, or RVTTI, in the literature as the time taken from identified risk uncertainty to fully express in the top event. Each threat will take a different length of time to eventuate, so this can be shown by the length of the arrow. Following the risk exposure or top event, there are consequence lines leading to each potential consequence, all the things that could happen. This velocity had not been previously identified in the literature, and I called it risk velocity time to outcome, or RVTTO, and defined it as the length of time from the impact of the risk leading to each individual consequence. So there can be many different RVTTOs. Each potential consequence also has its own risk velocity time to recover, or RVTTR, defined from the literature as the time taken from the impact of a risk exposure to return to normal operations or the health or business process or person. RVTTR could be both acute or chronic. Use of risk velocity combined with a bow tie risk analysis technique like this may reduce uncertainty by visually representing where time needs to be taken into consideration when we manage a risk. My research also identified that controls for risks also have velocity. I have applied two engineering definitions to clarify how long risk controls last for. I defined mean time to failure as the mean length of time a system or a system component is expected to operate before it fails. And I defined operating time to failure as the time that a given control takes to fail, which might be acute or chronic. And once I'd done that, I decided we needed a simple way to apply all of this. So I created some qualitative descriptors that help apply the concept of risk velocity to my case studies. I want to show you now how these apply to the bibliotoxicology field and how consideration of risk and control velocity may improve overall risk management of poison books. So at the top here is a very simplified bow tie for your poison book project. So you've got your creation of an arsenical book, the handling of it, the possible poisoning, which can be acute or chronic. And there's a very significant literature on arsenicosis due to both the very lengthy history of this poison and the effects of drinking groundwater contaminated with heavy metals and arsenic, particularly in Bangladesh and India. Given this very extensive literature, the knowledge of the risk of exposure to arsenic, the Poison Book Project has employed the precautionary principle. This exposure risk is now identified, and therefore there is a responsibility to reduce exposure to workers handling the books and members of the public who want to read them. So, how does risk velocity help you here? Risk velocity time to cause, or RVTTC, to the arsenic exposure is extremely slow. Risk velocity time to impact is medium slow to slow, as it's taken some time before the impact of having books contaminated
you have chocolate all over your face, my love.
Or other hazardous substances has been realized in the wider book conservation field. Chronic risk velocity time to outcome is dependent on exposure to emerald green. Latency for skin cancers associated with ingestion of arsenic may be 3 to 4 decades. Neuropathy is several years, and other chronic effects are also slow to very slow. Whether there'd be enough absorption to cause chronic ill health effects for people that regularly handle arsenical books is yet to be determined. Risk velocity time to outcome for acute arsenic exposure is extremely fast. Risk velocity time to recover is likely to be medium slow to slow, if recovery is possible at all. Steinem et al. In 2007 described a person who suffered acute poisoning with arsenic suffering after effects 5 years after the event. It's difficult to identify risk velocity time to recover for chronic exposure to arsenic. Even in the literature reviews, the focus is on the effects of exposure rather than recovery time. In terms of the exposure from emerald green books, the level of chronic exposure has not yet been identified, or it hadn't in the papers that were published. That may have been done since. So the controls that you identified in your papers, Melissa, also have velocity. And I did an analysis of the arsenic exposure controls that you applied as part of the Poison Book Project, and I've grouped them according to the New Zealand Health and Safety Legislative Hierarchy of Control. And I assessed the controls against my qualitative descriptors for velocity. So I want to note too that in the New Zealand hierarchy, under our Health and Safety at Work Act, administrative controls and personal protective equipment are the least effective type of control for reducing risks to health and safety. So the mean time to failure, which is the time the control is valid for, varies depending on the type of control that's present. For example, digitization is an extremely slow control. It's valid for a very long time because it means that people are completely separated from exposure to the contaminated books. However, the operating time to fail for the digitization control is extremely fast, as a person may still access the actual book itself. So remember, the mean time to fail is how long the control is expected to last for its useful life, and the operating time to fail is how fast it will fail when it does break. Controls that separate a person from a physical book have a very long mean time to failure. Those that rely on a person to remember to do something, like following training or a written procedure, have a much shorter mean time to fail. Almost all of the controls that you've identified and put in place have a fast or extremely fast operating time to failure, which describes how fast they fail. Extremely fast, that the control can fail instantaneously. This is because the controls in place rely on the actions of people to remember to shelve the books in the right areas, bag the books, use the fume cupboards for conservation, and so on. So a person has to do something and recall their training on how to do it. Procedures and training always have an instantaneous mean time to fail. And when I did my research, I did a lot of research into how expected lengths of time procedures and training are effective for. And the qualitative descriptors I've developed assist in differentiating risks that might otherwise be grouped together as similar and therefore potentially missed for management attention, particularly if a likelihood consequence assessment's used for the effectiveness of risk control. And these qualitative descriptors also provide further clarity for understanding how effective our risk controls are, how long we can expect them to be effective for. Consideration of velocity provides practitioners with a further way of identifying which areas require the most attention and an estimate of timeframes involved in management of risk. Control velocity provides additional clarity to asset managers, financial management accountants, controlling capital and operational expenditure, and risk professionals by identifying expected time until an asset or a control fails, your mean time to failure, and when it fails, how quickly it will be damaged, the operating time to failure, both acute and chronic. A fast velocity risk might require immediate attention and planning. The velocity of a slow velocity risk, such as bibliotoxicology, may be significantly longer than the service life of your average risk management plan, or the employment timeframes of the employees that might put that plan in place. Therefore, it means records retention requirements vary depending on the legislative framework of your risk, but your average retention requirements is 7 to 10 years, at least in New Zealand it is, which is a slow risk velocity. It therefore gives us a challenge to all our organisations. How do we manage risks and records for risks with slow or extremely slow risk velocity, the ones that last for, in this case, 50 years or more, so that knowledge captured by risk velocity assessments retained and used to reduce uncertainty on an ongoing basis. And the conclusion I came to in my case study on velocity and bibliotoxicology is that incorporation of this into your process might significantly assist in your long-term management and planning around poison books. And I'm delighted to say that I submitted my thesis on this last week. It has been accepted and I'm waiting for my professor to complete grading.
Congratulations, Robyn. That's wonderful. And thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. Do we have questions for Robyn? If so, please use the raise hand function and you can ask your question live, or if you prefer to drop it into the chat, you may do that as well. Carissa.
Hi, Robyn. I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question yet, but while I was looking at your the second to last slide, the slide we spent a lot of time on looking at the different your poison book bow tie evaluation, and there were obviously the right side column was lots of red because they were short velocities or short time frames. Is there any sort, I mean, obviously it's very notable that they're all short time frames to failure. Is there anything in your evaluation that takes into account like almost like stacking of these things, or is the goal to have one long-term, one short-term, some medium terms? Like, are you looking for balance across these velocities as an effective planning measure, or is there like, if you have like 10 short-term ones, that's okay because there's lots of sorry, I'm not sure how to phrase.
I understand where you're coming from. You've hit on a really important point in management of health and safety risk, which is that there's a term for it. We sometimes call it accumulation of controls, and sometimes we use that military term defense in depth. And so you're right, you could stack them up. That's a slightly different part outside of the velocity assessment. It's assessing how effective you have your controls in terms of how many you have in place. One thing I did do in my wider assessment on another one of my projects was look at how those velocities interact, but there's further research that needs to happen in that area. From a pure health and safety point of view, the idea is you do have your defence in depth, so that if one control fails, you've got something else there that's going to pick up the pieces and hopefully stop the person getting exposed to whatever that risk might be. I'm hoping to be able to do some more research to figure out how much velocity adds to that concept of defence in depth. But my research report, part of my master's was taught, so it was only a 20,000 word research report. I didn't have enough words to go into that piece in as much detail as I would have liked. But the idea is, yes, you stack them up and you identify which ones are most effective, and you spend most time making sure that those ones are in place. So it comes down to your control assurance activity as well. It's not just put the control there, it's is it working, and is it working the way we designed it to, and how do we know it's working? So it's that piece that wraps around it too. Great question, thank you. Does that answer what you? Yeah, cool.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it's quite a complicated web, but that does help me understand the picture a little bit better.
Cool. Okay, I don't know who
Thanks,
was second.
Teresa. And Timothy?
Yeah, well, it's a remark, but it's certainly come up that in this time of the pandemic, as you were alluding to, when the pandemic hit, there was me, 2 other scientists, and manager X. Since then, I've had 3 different managers, potentially a 4th different manager, and I'm the only scientist that now remains in the entire group.
Yes.
And people around me are going, succession planning from upper management, where is it? Where is it? And certainly I think right now, here with the Poison Book group and how the interesting timing of the Poison Book group being launched, and a lot of people around the world are dealing with succession planning, maybe as a risk.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I found very interesting when I realized how long some of these risks took, both before they showed up and then some of the effects they had. And I'd known that instinctively from 20 years of practice, but actually putting it down and creating some descriptors to capture that concept was very helpful, because it was exactly that thought. Well, a term of employment might be, well, if you've got tenure, it might be quite a long time, but it might be something from very short to quite long. But none of us are going to be around for the 150 years that arsenic's around for or more. So how do we capture that? What is it that we need to do? What will shift in the field of risk management as we start thinking through how do we capture this stuff and make sure that it remains effective? Because it's doing an assessment like this is really helpful, but it's only helpful for as long as you remember it. And people do something about it. But yes, you're right. The pandemic did show that to us, a lot of us. Thanks, Timothy.
Susan?
I was wondering if your model, obviously you can't share everything in your concept, but if your model incorporates, like, instead of just the speed at which things are failing, how catastrophically they fail. So like, like the bags can fail like in an instant, but because one bag fails or 20 bags fail, the other 600 you've got out are still okay.
Yeah, and that's another element of management of health and safety risk is the whether it's catastrophic failure is a good way to describe it. I always go back to my time in heavy engineering, and manufacturing, where a catastrophic failure was basically a pipe burst and you ended up with stuff in many places stuff should not go in large quantities, very, very large quantities. But so my assessment looked at that, but I was mostly focusing on the time element for this thesis. But in terms of general risk management, yes, that is something you think about. But your instantaneous fail could be an acute failure, but your acute, for some cases, might be your bag bursts and a little bit of stuff goes, or an acute failure in might be a failure of containment if you've contained them all together and they're not individually bagged, and you've got, you know, a box fails and you've got much bigger exposure. I didn't look at that in great detail in this assessment, but that is in the back of my mind. And as I said, from a heavy engineering background, that was something we were very conscious of. Great comment.
Great, thank you. Elise, question?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot first, Robyn, for this wonderful presentation. And one question about risk management and protective measures to you and maybe to the panel as well. So in Germany, we have this special guidelines. There you have like a hierarchy. So you have to do technical measures first, then
Yes.
organizational, and then you have to do personal things. So is it the same
Yes.
with you?
It's
Okay.
very similar in New Zealand. I'll just bring my presentation back up for a sec and I can step you through it here. Once Zoom decides it's going to let me share my screen again, or not. There we go. So yes, just full screen it so it's easy to see. So in New Zealand, we're required to try and remove the risk altogether first, so control by elimination. If we can't, next step, we're required to try and control by isolation. So that separates a person from a risk. And you can use time or distance or shielding for that separation. Engineering controls is your next option if you can't isolate. And that's where you're conserved under fume hood. That fits into an engineering control. And then under that are our least effective forms of control because they rely on people to do things. And those are your administrative controls, your procedures, training, things of that sort, and personal protective equipment, which is your least one. But interestingly, doesn't always have the fastest velocity. One of my other case studies looked at the explosion of Whakaari White Island, which was a volcanic disaster in New Zealand in 2019. 52 people were visiting a volcano when it erupted, and a good portion of them died, unfortunately. But what was interesting there is the PPE available actually has quite long velocity in some cases. But yes, sure, that same process applies here. But getting back to the earlier question about defence in depth and layering of controls, obviously if you've eliminated the risk altogether, that's awesome. It's gone away. In your case, because it's a digitisation control, people might still request to see the actual book and handle and deal with the actual book, which is why you still have an operating time to fail. Usually if it's eliminated, it's just gone. You don't worry about it anymore. But then you can layer these ones. You can limit the length of time that people have access to the books. You can also do that in a fume hood with procedures and personal protective equipment. So that's your layering of control, and therefore you get much better control of your risk. So yes, great comment. And yes, New Zealand has a very similar process to Germany, which is I was familiar with and good to hear too. Thank you.
Any final questions for Robyn? Okay. Thank you so much, Robyn. That was really a fantastic presentation. It framed the challenges that we're facing, I think, in a very digestible format, but also, at least for me, in a new way of thinking very systematically about the risk. And I think that that it's really also going to help us understand what are the areas where we need more research or where we need to bring in external expertise to guide where we're trying to go with things. So I really can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
It's fantastic, and I'm definitely going to be rewatching that the recording.
Thank you, and I'm more than happy to make my PowerPoint available, and also the actual full write-up for my thesis will cut out some of the the usual stuff that sits in a thesis that you have to stick in there, but I'm happy to do a condensed version of that and make that available. I'm also
fantastic.
more than happy to continue to work with the project. It's a privilege to be part of it.
Well, you're a welcome part of it, so thank you very much.